Hello everybody, my name's Paul Edmondson, but I'm here with Professor Sir Stanley Wells, who is perhaps the leading Shakespeare scholar in the world and has been for a long time. We're honoured to have Stanley as the honorary president of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, but of course he has long associations with Stratford-upon-Avon, having been the director of the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham. He's the editor of the Oxford Shakespeare and the Penguin Shakespeare. He's written many books about Shakespeare, and he's always had close ties with King Edward VI Grammar School, and he's now going to introduce me.
Yes, and this is Paul Edmondson, Dr. Paul Edmondson, who is head of research and something else, is it, at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and has studied Shakespeare extensively over many years. He's written several books himself about Shakespeare, including one on Twelfth Night, for example, and a book entirely devoted to Shakespeare. And along with me, he's edited a couple of volumes, one called The Shakespeare Circle, which is about the people that Shakespeare knew in Stratford, including many people who were associated, of course, with the school. And also one called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which we counter any possible thoughts that Shakespeare might not have written the works that are properly attributed to him. He's also a priest in the Church of England, so he's very well qualified to talk and think about Shakespeare in general.
We've just produced all the sonnets of Shakespeare from Cambridge University Press, which we're here to talk in the light of because it takes us very much to the heart of Shakespeare's school education. It's, we hope, a groundbreaking book. Why might we say that? It's because for the first time we put the sonnets, which were first published in 1609, and there were 154 of them printed, we put them into a putative chronological order. It's never been done before in this way. And while we've been doing that, we've interspersed the speeches and the prologues and the epilogues which occur in Shakespeare's plays, which are cast into sonnet form in among his 1609 sonnets. So those 154 sonnets, which first were printed in 1609, have been augmented to 182 sonnets.
Yes, including passages such as the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, and the most famous one, I suppose, the opening dialogue between Romeo and Juliet, in which they declare their love for each other, which Shakespeare casts into sonnet form, very appropriately because the sonnet was so often used as a medium for declarations of love. Of course, Shakespeare went to school in this very room. In his time, it would have held about 40 pupils, we believe. All boys, there was no secondary education for girls in his time, and they would have been taught by a well-qualified master. One master normally, along with perhaps an usher, an assistant teacher, a younger teacher who would be helping to keep the boys in order. They had very well-qualified teachers. Some of them we know went to the University of Oxford, for example. So they were, and of course the education was very much a literary education, based primarily on the classics, on Latin and on Greek. And here Shakespeare would have read the books that had so greatly influenced him over all his career. The most influential of all, I believe, was Ovid's Metamorphoses, the long poem telling stories of classical myths and legends about the gods and goddesses of the past, which he read in the original Latin, of course, and also there was a translation of it available to him. And that work pervades his own writing right to the end. In The Tempest, for example, one of Prospero's major speeches is based on it.
So in a sense, he never forgot his school education and what was drilled into him in this very room. But our new book, in putting the sonnets into chronological order, really removes from them any predetermined story which has hovered over these poems for 2.5 centuries. The story was never there in the first place. It was brought to them by an 18th century scholar called Edmund Malone, and this story is about a fair youth and a dark lady. And it's simply not there. There are poems addressed in many different directions within the 1609 collection. Importantly for our purposes, what our book demonstrates is that Shakespeare was writing sonnets over about 30 years. So he certainly wasn't setting out to write a sequence, he certainly wasn't setting out to tell a story. And first among them, in the first part of the book, pre-1582, are 3 poems. I'll talk about one of them first before taking us back to the schoolroom. And this poem is sonnet 145. And in 1971, as late as 1971, it was suggested by the Shakespeare scholar Andrew Gurr that this might be Shakespeare's earliest poem. Why? Because it's cast in iambic tetrameter, not pentameter, and it begins with "those lips that love's own hand did make." And in the couplet, we hear a pun on the name of the woman whom Shakespeare married in 1582. "I hate from hate away," she threw, "and save my life, saying, not you." And hate away was an alternative pronunciation of Hathaway. So you admit that Sonnet 145 might be a really early poem that throws open the dating of the whole collection. And looking at it again carefully, as Stanley and I have, and doing a lot of reading around the sonnets, we were especially struck, weren't we, by the final two sonnets printed, sonnets 153 and 154, because remember, the order in which they were printed is not the order in which Shakespeare wrote them.
Yeah, those two poems, 153 and 154, are unusual in several ways. One is that they are not personal poems. Each of them tells a little story, or a fable indeed, and each of them tells the same story. Both of them, in fact, are not original to Shakespeare. They are based on a Greek verse anecdote, a little story which was written originally in Greek, which goes back to the 5th century AD. It was available to Shakespeare in a Latin translation, and the original was written by a man known as Marianus Scholasticus, and his work had been printed in Florence in 1494, the written centuries earlier. No one knows where Shakespeare found this original poem on which he based these last two sonnets, but we suggest that he may have got to know it and have translated it in this very room, in this schoolroom. It may have been part of his education.
It was common for schoolboys to translate Latin and Greek poems in Shakespeare's time. I like to think of Shakespeare having a really good European education, as the humanism from Italy, where it was flourishing, moved across Europe and was appropriated through Erasmus into the English school system. And so it was the classical education from the continent which the schoolboys of Shakespeare's generation were receiving. And so this poem, this Greek, sometimes it's called an epigram, by Marianus Scholasticus, in English, reads, "Beneath these plane trees, detained by gentle slumber, love slept, having put his torch in the care of the nymphs. But the nymphs said to one another, why wait? Would that together with this we could quench the fire in the hearts of men. But the torch set fire even to the water, and with hot water thenceforth the love nymphs fill the bath." That's the source for the final two sonnets printed in Shakespeare's collection.
Yes, it's usually been supposed that they were written perhaps late in Shakespeare's career, but there's several arguments against that, I think. One is it seems very unlikely that late in his career, after becoming the world's greatest playwright and being much involved with the theatrical scene, why would Shakespeare have been bothering at that time in his life, one asks oneself, to translate poems originally written in Greek and from a Latin translation? Isn't it far more likely, we felt, that, and somebody else has suggested this before, that hasn't been taken much notice of, isn't it much more likely that he would have done this at school, that it would have been part of an academic exercise? It is an academic exercise, particularly when you think that each of them tells the same story. Each of them is a version of the same poem. And one of them, it has been, again, well demonstrated, is a revision of the other. In other words, it's almost as if perhaps the schoolmaster had said to him, well, William, you've done quite nicely with that version, but look, wouldn't it go better if you made these lines into such and such a sequence? Couldn't you improve the structure by telling a story in a slightly different way? And that's what happens, isn't it, in those two poems?
It is, and what's curious too is that the first of the two poems is printed last. So 154, as far as we know, and this goes back to an argument, a brilliant article from 1942 by James Hutton, who, because of his classical training and his deep knowledge of Greek and Latin literature, was able to demonstrate why we can say that 154 was written before 153. So Stanley's going to read Sonnet 154, and we'll think about it a little bit, and then I'll read, as it were, the later version and see if you can hear the differences.
Okay, here's the poem printed in 1609 at the end of the collection. The little love god, that's Cupid of course, the little love god lying once asleep, laid by his side his heart-inflaming brand, whilst many nymphs that vowed chaste life to keep came tripping by. But in her maiden hand the fairest votary took up that fire which many legions of true hearts had warmed, and so with a general of hot desire was sleeping by a virgin hand disarmed. This brand she quenched in a cool well by, which from love's fire took heat perpetual, growing a bath and helpful remedy for men diseased. But I, my mistress thrall, came there for cure, and this by that I prove, love's fire heats water, water cools not love.
It reads like a little essay because he's proving something at the end,
It
doesn't
is,
it?
yes. Quaerat disputandum.
This is what I've set forth, and look, I've just done it. Yeah, which is the kind of training he would have received here.
Oh, very much so, yes.
And we think of this as imitatio, you know, going to a classical source and then taking from it freely enough to imitate the kind of writing.
Yes, as a way of improving your own education.
And inventio, that you use a source as a point of departure to make something your own.
Right.
So it's a very good illustration of those kinds of training, isn't it?
Very much so, yes.
But here is the later revision, Sonnet 153. Cupid laid by his brand and fell asleep. A maid of Dian's this advantage found, and his love-kindling fire did quickly steep in a cold valley fountain of that ground, which borrowed from this holy fire of love a dateless lively heat still to endure, and grew a seething bath, which yet men prove against strange maladies a sovereign cure. But at my mistress' eye love's brand new fired, the boy for trial needs would touch my breast. I, sick withal, the help of bath desired, and thither hied a sad distempered guest, but found no cure. The bath for my help lies where Cupid got new fire, my mistress' eyes.
Yeah. If you find those a little bit difficult to understand, it's not entirely surprising. They are, after all, written in Elizabethan English, but you find a great deal of help if you read them in our edition, where you will find explanatory notes on them, summaries, and also at the back of the book we print a paraphrase, a literal paraphrase of every poem in the volume.
We do, and listening to both read just now, Stanley, as you and I have read them, you know, one of the reasons, and this might just be the clincher actually, why we can think of 153 as the later version, is look at the first two lines of each. Stanley, could you just reread the first two lines of 154?
Yes, the first two lines of 154. The little love god, lying once asleep, laid by his side his heart-inflaming brand.
And in the later version, we have, well, let's first of all notice a mistake, which, you know, Master Shakespeare's not quite good enough. How can the love god be asleep and at the same time lay something to one side? So it doesn't make sense as narrative. It's not good enough. And in the beginning of 153, it's been revised. Cupid laid by his brand and fell asleep. He puts it in the right order. So this is I think this is the clincher for me, why it's a better version of the same story.
As if the schoolmaster had said, "Now, William, that's that's really nonsense. How could he do that while he was asleep?"
And also the improvement has taken 2 lines of verse and made them 1. So it's an improvement through compression. So that's one of the reasons why it's a compelling reason, I think.
So,
yeah. And there is a sort of sexiness, wouldn't you say, that creeps in towards the end of the later version. But found no cure, the bath for my help lies, where Cupid got new fire, my mistress' eyes. There's a sort of knowingness that the mistress whom I adore is actually fueling love. Her eyes are giving love itself new impetus.
And interestingly, of course, Shakespeare uses that phrase in a later sonnet, "My mistress' eyes." One of the sonnets begins "are nothing like the sun."
Yeah, and isn't that interesting how that's so often thought to have been a personal poem, My Mistress' Eyes, but here he's using it as part of an exercise in translation. So it's a sort of literary phrase at the same time, My Mistress' Eyes. It was a really good moment when we started to think about these poems as having been composed in this very schoolroom, because it demonstrated, didn't it, what we've set forth really in the new book, that many of these poems are personal poems. So to have come across them as inflected by his very schooling, his intellectual formation here, wasn't a surprise, really. And also at the same time, it felt original. And it was Stanley, it was you that said we should put them first in the volume. I think it was. Credit you for that one, Stanley. Because otherwise we'd have started with 145, the so-called Anne Hathaway poem.
We would, yes, but we believe these, you see, to have been written while he was at school, before he started courting Anne Hathaway, but obviously not before he started thinking about love and Cupid
and Mistress's Eyes.
Mistress's Eyes, yeah.
So sitting here, which is delightful in Shakespeare's very classroom, I'm reminded, and Stanley, I think you're reminded of when we gathered about 50 people together one summer a few years ago. We read the whole of Venus and Adonis.
That's Shakespeare's long narrative poem, published in 1593.
And it's the first time his name appeared in print.
Based on Ovid, on Ovid's Metamorphoses. Delightful poem, a funny, witty, erotic poem, telling of Venus's attempts to seduce the young, reluctant Adonis, and of his ultimate death when he's gored by a boar, or when he's hunting, because he prefers hunting to making love.
And you know, the examples of these 2 sonnets we've been looking at, Shakespeare's taking a source and augmenting it and starting to play more freely with it. You look at the length of Venus and Adonis in Ovid, it's short, and Shakespeare's hugely augmenting it to a poem of about 1,000 lines.
It's about about 70 lines in Ovid.
So that's how his imagination works.
Inventio, they called it in the Latin term, for the capacity to elaborate on a pre-existing story or theme.
So it's great to be here talking about these 2 sonnets in Shakespeare's Schoolroom, and to think that, you know, when you pick up your Shakespeare, when you dip into the sonnets, hopefully through our new book, but the most important thing is you read them however you can get your hands on them. Think about Shakespeare's schooling. Put the schooling back into the work as you read it, because it's there and it started right here. So when we get our world back to normal again, come here and read some Shakespeare for yourselves.